Welcome back to Proxamer, everybody. And today we're going to be doing another tier list. We're going to be trying to wrap up our tier lists with the last two categories, of course, the troops and the HQ. Today we're going to just look at troops. It's going to be kind of a short video because Eldar don't have that many troop choices. So we're only going to go over 4 troop choices today. But this is our updated troops tier list for November 2022. So just a quick overview before we start. We're going to be doing basically an analysis of where our troops units are in the current meta, accounting for the release of the new codexes, and of course the balanced data slates in Nephilim. And just as always, a disclaimer, these are just my opinions based on my own experiences and analysis of the rules and matchups in the current state of the game, and they are by no means definitive. So of course, some of you may have differing opinions on some of the units. I know that, for example, some of you guys might like Guardians a little more, or maybe like Corsair Void Reavers. Whatever the case may be, if you do and you disagree with one of my positions, please do leave a comment. I'd love to hear your position on it and, why you think that unit deserves the placement that it does. Anyway, let's get right into the tier list. So just a quick definition of what each tier means. In S tier, we have top of the line and best in slot for most competitive builds. A tier is going to be great units that are extremely effective in the role. B tier is going to be a solid unit but has some minor issues. And C tier is going to be weaker units that have more serious issues. And of course, D tier are really weak units that need a lot of help and investment and probably aren't worth taking in any type of list unless it's strictly just for fun. So to start off, we have Corsair Void Reavers. So Void Reavers are an interesting unit. They're basically one of the kill teams that we recently got. And they have really great damage for the cost. They cost 10 points a model. They have great damage with the Reavers of the Void ability, which basically is Blade Storm for all of their attacks. Or excuse me, not Blade Storm, Hail of Doom for all of their attacks. They have versatile weapon options, including anti-infantry and anti-tank options like blasters and shredders, both of which are Dark Eldar weapons. Basically, a shredder is a longer range death spinner with a little bit less AP and a little more range. And of course, the blaster is basically a short-ranged Dark Lance or Bright Lance. And they have a ranged and combat variant. They can take shuriken rifles, which are 24-inch rapid-fire shuriken catapults, essentially. And they can also take power weapons if they want to go into close combat. So they have a wide range of different builds. Now, here's the thing about them that most people do not like. They're not core or Craftworld, and they do not count as compulsory choices, which means that you can't use them to fill out your minimum troop requirements in a detachment. So I think this is what basically makes people not want these guys, is because you can't basically have them count as your minimum troops. So if you have a battalion, you can't use one of them as one of your 3 minimum troop choices, which is kind of detrimental because that means essentially you have to invest in these guys separately in addition to your other troops, which most players probably won't want to do. They're probably going to want to spend their points on things like swooping hawks or warp spiders or striking scorpions and not really waste their points on this unit. However, having said that, I recently learned something about these guys that I think kind of puts them in a solid place in the game and might actually make them worth considering in more competitive builds. So I recently found out, and I think this is how it works, but basically, as per the Eldar FAQ, Corsair Void Reavers can benefit from the Runes of Fate cast by a Wayseeker, which is a model that you can put in a Corsair Void Scarred unit. And essentially what this means is that you can benefit from the Wayseeker's psychic powers, because a Wayseeker's psychic powers can actually target Enratha units. So basically what that means is Guide, Fortune, Doom, all of those can benefit Enratha units. Now there is a catch to this. The Wayseeker replaces all instances of Ozerani core and Craftworld characters and units with Enratha units and characters. So what this means is the Wayseeker's psychic powers can no longer benefit regular Craftworld units. You cannot cast Guide on a unit of Guardians. You cannot cast Guide on a unit of Shroudrunners with the Wayseeker. You can only cast them on other Enratha units like Void Reavers and Void Scarred. And same thing with Doom, right? Ozerani units are not going to be able to benefit from this ability. So if you cast Doom on something, the rest of your army is really not going to be able to benefit from it. Only the reavers and the Void Scarred are going to be able to benefit. And of course, if you are running Prince Riel, he will benefit as well. So this can kind of be a downside, right? But the thing is that these guys are really great dual role units. And they work specifically well with the guide because of their Reavers of the Void ability, which basically turns every 6 to hit into a 6 to wound. So this is really great with the Shuriken rifles because of the Shuriken ability, and this is really good with the power swords. So essentially these guys can charge in, they're dealing 2 attacks apiece with the fact that they also have guide and the Reavers of the Void. So these guys for 10 points a model can actually carve up Terminators, can carve up things like that pretty easily with the guide ability. Now, having said that, here's a little bit of a disclaimer. I did see this in the errata, but I might be missing something because I haven't heard a lot of talk about this in the competitive circles, and I feel like I probably would have heard something about this if there wasn't a little more to it. So I do thank the subscriber that brought this to my attention. Absolutely amazing combination. I hope it works the way that it reads. I hope there's not some sort of catch or some sort of, special exemption or something like that I'm missing here. But, if it works as intended, that's really awesome. That means that a Wayseeker can cast Guide on a unit of Void Reavers or Void Scarred, and they can absolutely tear apart an enemy unit, which is something I definitely did not know before. So I really appreciate that. And yeah, I think this unit can actually be good in a couple of builds because of that. I think they can be extremely strong, especially if you outkit them with power swords or something like that. Or even if you just give them the Shuriken rifles and they can stay back on an objective, or kind of hide a little bit, because you can take them as squads of 5 as well. So they can be a very cheap choice. They can also benefit from guide, and they can also be held back in reserve if you need them to threaten a flank. So I think actually these guys are pretty solidly B tier. I think they have a lot of potential. So yeah, something I didn't think before, to be honest with you. If I didn't know that, I probably would have put them in C tier, just not being able to be buffed, not being able to, be a compulsory choice and things like that, I think would kind of be a nail in the coffin for them. But hey, with that ability, they're pretty awesome, and I think they have some good potential. Okay, on to Guardian Defenders. So Guardian Defenders I also put in B tier because I think even though Guardians are not considered the best unit, I still think they have pretty solid damage and firepower. Their cost is fairly average at 9 points per model, so not too expensive. And they can reroll 1s with Shurikens when within range of an objective, which is always nice. However, I think their failings as a unit are that they're pretty squishy for an objective holder. And of course, Eldar's strength doesn't lie in holding objectives. It lies in denying objectives to enemy units and then taking those said objectives away near the end of the game. And also, the weapon platform just doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I think the weapon platform that GW basically wrote up for these guys is a really clunky rule set that doesn't really make a lot of sense and actually makes the unit worse. I know what you're saying. Oh man, the heavy weapon is so cool in Guardian squads. And it's just so useful, right? I hate to break it to you guys. Yes, it can be useful, just like any heavy weapon can. But, I just think it makes the unit weaker. Now, the reason why I think that it makes the unit weaker is because, first of all, it makes the unit more vulnerable to blast. It makes the unit count as 11 models. Even though the weapon platform doesn't count as a destroyed model for morale purposes, it still counts for starting strength. So essentially, it's going to count as an 11 model unit for blast weapons, which means that they're going to be more vulnerable to blast. And the weapon platform doesn't actually negate the negative modifier for moving and shooting with a heavy weapon. So if these guys choose to move, this thing cannot actually fire at full ballistic skill. It has to fire at -1, which also really sucks, right? So even though it's an additional model and it's a weapon platform, you would think it wouldn't have that penalty, but it still does. So again, the weapon platform is a good weapon, I guess, but it's really expensive. It's 20 points base. And, of course, it costs extra if you want to give it a missile launcher or bright lance or star cannon. And then on top of that, it suffers the penalty for moving and shooting, and it makes the unit more vulnerable to blast. So I really don't think it's that worth it to put a heavy weapon on a Guardian squad in most cases. And I can definitely see some people running with a heavy weapon. And, honestly, I've run it with a heavy weapon myself just because, to be honest with you, how I have my Guardians built, there's 2 Guardians who basically look like they're, controlling a heavy weapon. So it looks kind of awkward to put them on the battlefield without one. But to be honest with you, the heavy weapon, it kind of makes the squad worse, I have to be honest. So that's kind of why I put them in B tier. I think if they fixed up the heavy weapon, made them a little bit cheaper, I think they'd be a better unit. But as of now, they just kind of feel clunky for what they're supposed to be doing, and they don't really have a solid role that they're effective at. I know what GW meant for them to be effective at, but to be honest with you, they're just not that effective at holding objectives. So I ended up giving these guys B tier, not because they're a good objective holder, but because they're a solid damage-dealing troop choice. And that's about it. They make pretty good target for buffs, and, they're good for smaller games and stuff like that, but they don't have much impact other than just contributing some shuriken fire, which, to be honest with you, isn't really something that we need loads of in our lists, because we already have things like Dire Avengers, we already have things like Wind Riders and stuff like that. They can easily fill that role and do much more on top of it. All right, and next is Storm Guardians, my absolute favorite unit, which is ironic because I'm actually going to be having to run them in an Escalation League coming up this summer. So I'm going to have to buy some, and to be honest with you, I really just don't like the unit, but I don't really have a choice. Now, having said that, I think Storm Guardians are, they have a lot of issues, but let's start off with the pros. So the pros are they're fairly cheap. They're 8 points a model, which isn't a terrible cost, and they do have access to 4 special weapons per unit, which is an amazing amount of heavy weapons, actually. Not a lot of units can get up to 4 heavy weapons, so this is a very special kind of thing that Storm Guardians have. You can take 2 fusion guns and 2 flamers. Now, the problem with it is that the fusion guns cost 10 points a model, and the flamers cost 5 points a model, so they're fairly expensive special weapons. Other than that, they're pretty weak in combat, and combat is supposed to be something they're decent at, but they have very weak combat stats. Strength 3, their weapon doesn't give them an extra strength, it just gives them +1 attack, and it gives them -1 AP, which, to be honest, against most opponents isn't going to do much. And they're not very good at taking or holding objectives. So they're not good at taking objectives because even with the +1 to hit, they basically need to be on that objective to actually get the bonus. Or at least attacking an enemy unit that's on an objective. So again, if they're not doing either of those 2 things, then they're not getting the, rerolls to hit. And they're not great at supporting other combat units because they just often get in the way. So they're a large squad. They're a minimum squad of 10. So if you're charging them in with other combat units, they can easily get in the way of those combat units. If you're not careful, they can easily muck things up and not really do a whole lot. So oftentimes you're better off not even charging the Storm Guardians in some cases than actually charging them in with your other units. So overall, I think Storm Guardians have a huge problem because they don't really have a role, just like Guardian Defenders. Except Guardian Defenders at least do some damage, right? Guardian Defenders can shell out shuriken, catapult shots, and they can actually kill stuff. Storm Guardians just don't really do that. Even though they have the pistols and everything, just very short range weapons. They need a lot of investment to work. You either need to invest command points to put them in reserve, or you need to invest in a transport for them to actually get into combat safely, because or else they're just easy bolter fodder. And they just don't really do a whole lot in general. So they're very squishy. They don't hold objectives, and they don't take objectives especially well, especially against units that are going to be holding objectives. We're talking Space Marines. We're talking, hardcore heavy duty units. And I guess the argument is to be made that, well, can Storm Guardians ever be made good? I'm sure they can be made good in a couple of builds. I know Savage Blades, and I know some of the far-flung Craftworld traits like Vengeful can make them a little better. And I know this stuff, but, honestly, even if that's the case, there's just better units for the price. You're basically paying 100 points per unit because you're probably going to take a couple of special weapons in there. And for 100 points, you can probably get a unit of Striking Scorpions for around the same cost, which is going to give you a lot more than the Storm Guardians ever could. So I think Storm Guardians are in a really bad place. I put them in C tier. I usually don't put units in C tier unless they really have some serious weaknesses. And I do think Storm Guardians fit that bill. So Storm Guardians, definitely a C tier unit and probably in need of some serious buffage. And lastly, we have Rangers. So Rangers are our S tier troop choice. Now, why are they S tier? They're not particularly good as far as damage goes. They're not particularly effective when it comes to surviving. So why are these an S tier troop choice? Well, Eldar already aren't good at holding objectives, so Rangers not being able to hold objectives well doesn't really matter too much. However, what Rangers are great at is screening enemy units and scoring objectives. So they're great at scoring objectives like behind enemy lines. They're great at scoring objectives like scout the enemy, obviously, because that's kind of a Ranger objective anyway, even though other units can do it as well. And their advanced positions gives them excellent battlefield control. They can steal away positions from enemy units that also have advanced positions if you can deploy to an area first. They're a very cheap way to do this. And they are the cheapest troop unit available to us that's also compulsory. And they're actually, not for nothing, but they're decently durable in terrain. And they're pretty easy to hide. Because they're a 5-man unit, they can easily hide behind obscuring terrain, and you can keep that unit alive for longer than, say, a Guardian unit, which you might not be able to hide behind every piece of obscuring terrain very easily. And also, lastly, even though Rangers don't do a lot of outright damage, they do a lot of ping damage against key targets and characters with the Strands of Fate ability. So if you need an extra wound dealt, let's say, and this happens more often than you would think, but let's say you need one wound taken off of a tank, right? You can use them to shoot at that tank and get, a mortal wound on it with Strands of Fate, stuff like that. Or if you need one wound left on a character, you can pick off that character. So even though they don't have a lot of outright damage, they have a lot of Strands of Fate synergy and are able to pick off key targets when you need to. And in general, they're just a very good and versatile unit that can handle a lot of different situations very well. So I definitely want them in S tier. And I think that's generally accepted that for the Eldar, I think Rangers are easily our best troop choice and a very good troop choice regardless of what army you're looking at. All right, everybody. So, with that being said, I would just like to say a couple of things about our troop category in general, because I think that the Eldar troop choices are kind of one of those things that are balanced badly internally, and I think GW really needs to help that out a little bit. So what I would suggest for GW is, decrease the points cost of some of these units and maybe rework some things like the heavy weapon platform and stuff like that. Maybe give, Corsairs the, not the Craftworld, but maybe the core keyword so that they can benefit from certain buffs outside of, the Wayseeker and stuff like that. So, and Prince Riel. And I think what this would do is this would actually make it so that, you would see more of other units in lists. You would see more players taking Guardian Defenders and Storm Guardians. You would see more players taking Corsair Void Reavers and so forth. And I think those changes would really go a long way towards not only helping with the internal balance of the Codex, but also increasing the build versatility of players in both the competitive and casual scenes equally as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. I know it was a kind of a short one, but, there's not much to talk about when it comes to Eldar troops. There's not many of them, and honestly, the only ones that are really, really good are Rangers. And other than that, we have a couple of okay, solid choices with the Corsair Void Reavers and Guardians. Well, Guardian Defenders, that is. And then, of course, we have the Storm Guardians, which just are in need of a lot of help, honestly. Alrighty, that's going to be it for today. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody, if you do celebrate it, and have a great one, everybody. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.